So again, thank you very much indeed for having accepted this interview generously and sending me the book equally generously. I'm very pleased to meet you here in Bologna, and I hope we have a rewarding exchange of ideas. So some of them, I would categorize my questions into 3 categories. Some of them is like your intellectual itinerary, from where you started until where you stand now. Some of them are actually some triggers for you to elaborate on some parts of your books. Like you would kindly explicate some parts. And some of them are my concerns, my problems that I want to exchange with you. So if you don't mind, I have an introductory note about you, and then you can update it if there is something missing, and then I start with the questions. Sandro Mezzadra teaches political theory at the University of Bologna. He's a adjunct professor at the Institute for Culture and Society of the Western Sydney University and the Center for Cultural Research and Development at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. His recent work has centered on the relations between globalization, migration, and capitalism, on contemporary capitalism, as well as on post-colonial criticism. Among his prolific writings and books, I mentioned a couple of them, recent ones, in the Marxian Workshops, 2018, Border as Method with Brett Neilson, it was 2019? 13, right, yeah. So, Politics of Operations in 2019, again with Brett Neilson. And your new book, co-authored with Neilson, The West and the Rest, or The Rest and the West, which would be a part of my question, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World, is forthcoming from Versho in 2024, actually next month, I think.
Yeah, in a couple of weeks.
So my first question is the frustration that prompted people like Anthony Negri, Paolo Virno, and others to look beyond the defeat of the industrial working class and the repression of autonomous movements takes on a different form in your work. As you try to come to terms with the new social, economic, and political landscapes, you elaborate a new horizon. How have you dealt with this frustration in your work?
First of all, there is a kind of generational difference between me and the 2 friends of mine that you mentioned, which means Paolo Virno and Tony Negri. I was a kid at the end of the 70s when in Italy both the repression of the autonomist movement and the attack against working class power began. Although I was a kid, I was part of the autonomist movement, so I was kind of involved in the campaigns, in the whole stuff. I was also involved in the support to working class struggle against the attack that I have mentioned. But my involvement was different, even biographically, because I want to repeat it, I was a kid. And so in the following years, I started to reflect on that double defeat, we can say. And at first, I was part of an attempt to reorganize the autonomist movement in Italy in quite a traditional way, taking the 1970s as a model. I was living in Genoa in the 1980s, and I also participated in important workers' struggles, above all in a long struggle of the dockers against beginning processes of containerization of ports. I think that this experience has been important for me. It has been important because that struggle was presented by the media as a kind of purely resistance struggle, while I started to understand, talking to port workers, that the stake was very high in that struggle, and it did not regard only the port of Genoa, but the global network of ports, the reorganization of supply chains, which means topics that have become central in my work after 25, 30 years. Know. But then there was something else that happened in Genoa and in Italy, of course, but I experienced it in Genoa. I like to call it the encounter with migration.
All right.
Right. To put it very quickly, in the 1980s, Genoa was a white city.
All right. All right.
I mean, there were some black maritime workers, but the city was white. At least in our perception, because of course, things were more complicated. Then the situation changed, and we realized it quite abruptly, because in 1993, in the summer, there were riots in the center of the city with Italian youngsters attacking migrants, And this did not happen only in Genoa, because, as you may know, Italy has been for more than a century a country of emigration. And it became also a country of immigration between the 80s and the 90s. So there were similar events in other Italian cities. But for us, I like to think of that experience in collective terms. It was a kind of shock, because we had no experience at all with anti-racism, And in 1993, after the summer, we met a group of migrants, basically from Morocco and from Senegal, and we built a kind of association, that has been quite successful in the following years. Successful, first of all, in prompting mass mobilization of migrants, and in a way in imposing the legitimacy of the presence of migrants in the very center of the city.
Right.
This has kind of challenged my whole world view, if you wish, even my training in Italian autonomist Marxism. So I have started to problematize a whole set of notions,
right.
And Maybe this is the event that has shaped my work in the following 30 years in the most visible way. You know.
Sandro, when you talk about like migration, one of the specific attributes that you actually pinpoint when it comes to migration is the autonomy of migration. I mean, autonomy is also applicable to the migration and migrants. So autonomy of migration goes beyond the economic and social malaise and understands migration as a social movement, actually, as you mentioned in the preceding years. So which is actually related to your understanding of space as something heterogeneous. You know, it's not only about subjects; it's also about space. Yeah, not only subjects are seen in a heterogeneous way, but also the space. So, what is the? I know it's a long shift from 80s and 90s. What is the today's embodiment of a significance of this heterogeneous emphasis on space? Are migrants, for instance, viewed in an ambivalent filter or valued as a social movement or even a resisting movement now?
You know, I could talk at length of the autonomy of migration.
Right.
It's a kind of phrase that emerged between the end of the 90s and the early 2000s from a dialogue between Italian and German activists and researchers. You know, Kanaka attack has been particularly important in that conjuncture.
Right.
What is striking and leads me toward your question is the fact that in the following years, let's say in the first decade of the 21st century, we kind of discovered that there were people thinking in the same terms about migration in many different places. You know. I will just mention a couple of them that have been particularly important for our discussion. Nick de Genova in the US, Ranabir Shamadar in India, Brett Neilson in Australia. The list could go on, you know. But this gives you an idea of the kind of intriguing geography of our discussion.
Right.
You know, I was saying Italy and Germany. Also France was important in some way for the work of Yamulye Butang, you know. But that's Europe. That's Europe and that's the European Union. If you take these three countries, they have quite different histories of migration. Right. Nonetheless, they are all European countries, you know. If you include the US in the discussion, well, you have a different geography, different histories of migration, different social, economic, cultural, political developments. And then think of India, you know. So I could say retrospectively that it has been precisely the kind of development of the discussion on the autonomy of migration that has confronted me with the need to think at the same time the elements of homogeneity that make up, let's say, the global space, and the profound differences, the profound heterogeneity that crisscross this space. Then coming to your last words, today I think that we have to reorganize a bit our reflection and even our research projects on migration. We are living through a conjuncture of war. This is a point that Brett and I try to make in the rest and the West. And of course, in a conjuncture of war, mobility becomes a stake. Mm-hmm. I think it is quite easy, unfortunately, to see this looking at recent developments of rhetoric on migration and migration policies in Europe. There is a kind of militarization of the discourse on migration. This is not new, but it is becoming
more crystallized,
more and more visible and crystallized, Then I also think that there is a need to look at the way in which, let's say, the spatiality, the spatial coordinates of migration are shifting in this conjuncture. There is a need to ask questions regarding the way in which movements of migration, practices of mass mobility concur to the formation of new regions in our world, of new regional spaces, I was saying how they concur, but in a way they can also contest the formation of new regional spaces. So this is an angle of migration that I think is particularly important today.
Sandro, you don't use the word work or labor. You use, with Brett, you use the word operation. I mean, work and labor as the terms that people like Hannah Arendt use. My question is, I'm focusing on the other book, The Politics of Operation, actually, again co-authored with Brett, where you analyze operations of capital in 3 domains. That's really interesting for me if you elaborate on that, namely extraction, logistics, and finance. You examine the ways in which these 3 domains, interact with each other, not separately, interact with each other. That's also important, with different factions of capital and with their outside. So my first tiny question here is the word operation, as I ask you, why the word operation? Or is there any connotation between operation here and Operasimo that you had in Italy? I mean, to what extent is operation related to Workerism and in this regard? And tell us, please, very basically about these 3 domains, because I think that's very enlightening to know about the interaction of these 3 apparently separate domains through extraction.
Sorry,
it is a lot of questions.
Okay, don't worry. When I speak about these 3 domains, extraction, logistics, and finance in Europe, or even in the United States, people look kind of skeptical. They often ask which is the connection between these domains. 1 month ago, I spent some time in Brazil, and I gave a talk in Belém. Belém is this important colonial city on the edge of the Amazon. And I was talking about extraction, logistics, and finance. And all the people I had the occasion to talk to were saying to me, but this is our everyday experience.
Life, right,
It's just a way, to put words on what we see. In the Amazon, you have extraction, which means mines, which means soil. You have infrastructures, giant infrastructures, which traverse and devastate the Amazon. And of course, you have financial actors that make all this possible. And you also see something quite interesting for me, which means that you have US corporations there, but you have Chinese actors. And they do pretty much the same, They do pretty much the same, precisely at the crossroads between extraction, logistics, and finance. What I can add is that Brett and I decided to focus on 3 domains because we were wary of a trend in critical studies, but particularly, in workerism, post-workerism, to take just one domain and to build a theory of capitalism starting from that domain. So we were thinking, why not 3 domains? And we picked these 3 domains that seem to us so important today and interlinked, But then we also added that our choice must not be understood as exclusive. There are other domains that one could add. For instance, digital platforms that are in many ways linked to logistics and to finance, while they have an extractive dimension.
Right.
Think of the words data mining, for instance. So it's a kind of open framework, but at the same time it focuses on 3 very important domains of capitalist operations.
Right.
And the word operation, I think we started to talk about operations as a concept, reading a lot of stuff on finance and logistics. Because in the language of finance and logistics, the word operation figures prominently,
Right.
And then, of course, we tried to elaborate. We went back to Hannah Arendt. We kind of discussed the philosophical dimension of the concept of operation. This is a concept that for us does not substitute labor. It's a concept that we use to describe the way in which capital acts.
All right.
But at the same time, also in the politics of operations, we have a chapter on what we call with Marx the composition of living labor, And there is a point in that chapter that is quite important for me, which means that we say labor today is more cooperative than ever in the history of capitalism. And this is a point that, for instance, Tony Negri and Michael Hart have repeatedly made. We had something, which means that living labor is more cooperative than ever in the history of capitalism, but at the same time, there is a radical gap between this cooperative dimension and the lived experience of living labor. You know, my usual example that I think works pretty well is the example of the rider. If you look at a rider with his or her bike, you know, an individual worker, a completely individualized worker, his or her experience of labor is fully individual, you know. But at the same time, you know that the work of that rider plays a role in the valorization of capital only because it is part of a wide network of cooperation.
Right.
And so this is, I think, a good image of what we mean when we speak about a gap.
Right.
You know.
So, and you see that in a kind of ambivalent way, or?
Yes, of course, we see it
like
in an ambivalent way, but in very abstract terms.
Right.
We can say that the problem today is the appropriation of this cooperative dimension by workers, it's a big problem,
right,
you know,
right.
But we have to say it.
Sure, definitely. It's not a question that what I'm asking, what I'm posing now. It's not a question; it's a comment. I would like you to elaborate on that, please. Mostly focusing on the term extraction. I mean, I'm moving to your most recent book, the book that's going to be out in a couple of weeks. You say in the introduction, I'm quoting you, in this book we elaborate the analysis of contemporary capitalism that we started to articulate in the politics of operation, investigating the mutations of capital and capitalism through an examination of the operative logic that drives investment and process of valorization, as you said now, in such domains as extraction, logistics, and finance. We flesh out in that book a shift in the composition of what we call, following Marx, aggregate capital, Gesamtkapital, an expanded reading of the notion of extraction beyond the literal reference to the word of oil, mining, relevance of specific fractions of capital, of capitalist actors that target and exploit process of social cooperation from the outside without directly organizing or coordinating the underlying productive activities. End of quote. I have nothing to ask. I would be happy to hear more about extraction here. And the difference between that book and the politics of operation. I mean, what is the new motif in this book in regard to Gesamtkapital that you raised already in the politics of operation?
You know, the lines that you have just read are a kind of summary of the politics of operations. In this new book, I think there is an attention to the fractures, the conflicts, the wars that characterize the global space today that was not present in the politics of operations. We ask a whole set of questions regarding the world market, the way in which the world market is working today, but also regarding the relations and tensions between political space, let's say the international system, and the space of capital, let's say the world system. You know. So this is, I think, the contribution of this book of the Rest and the West to current discussions of capitalism.
Right.
Moreover, we tackle again the question of globalization, you know, in a conjuncture in which, as you know, such rhetorical figures as decoupling, reshoring, friendshoring kind of prevail in the public discourse. Already in Borderless Method, we had kind of criticized the mainstream views of globalization. You know. And in this book, we kind of distinguish the rhetoric of globalization and what we call global processes. And we give several instances of global processes in the book. Our point is that, leaving aside the rhetoric of globalization, global processes continue to shape the working of capitalism, but also, you know, everyday life on the planet.
Right.
Saying this, of course, but I already made this point, doesn't imply the idea that the world is becoming kind of a smooth space, a homogeneous space.
Right.
There are elements of homogeneity. Think of digital platforms. Take the US and China. The US and China are both characterized by the deep processes of platformization. You know, and it is an element of homogeneity, but then you have
different
a lot of differences. Let's put it so.
Sure. And it's here, I think, that you shift in the new book. I mean, beautifully you said it's the summary of the last book, but in the new book, that's why you have the concept of polycrisis, if I'm not wrong, yeah? And the new book, the rest and the West, you underscore the concept of polycrisis or polycrisis. Already in the beginning of the new book, you say, I'm quoting you again, the rest and the West grapple with a wider and more complex predicament, one sometimes referred to as polycrisis, in which multiple and critically intensifying conditions collapse on each other: climate change, migration, health, geopolitical conflict, mounting economic inequalities, etc., etc. Today, invocations of the conjuncture often signal attention to non-proximate relations, stressing the importance of influences from elsewhere and connectivity across geographical scales. End of quote. Is the pursuit of polycrisis in the new book, in different spheres, as an act of is it seen as an act of is it observed as a crisis of capitalism in broader and more horizontal order, which is dispersed everywhere, rather than a myopic dichotomy, as the title would ironically be seen as the West and the rest? So you see my question? I mean, I think there is a point in choosing that title for the book, because first of all, you don't say the West and the rest, and somehow through this polycrisis, I don't think you're embracing this kind of dichotomy that is popular between the West and the rest, the North and the South. Would you also please elaborate on that?
You got it right. let's say that the West and the rest is a phrase famously introduced by Stuart Hall in the early 1990s and then popularized by many people. I mean, if you do a Google search, the West and the rest, you will get millions of results. Let me say that in Stuart Hall's mind, the West and the rest was not a way to emphasize a binary structure. Mm-hmm. Stuart Hall was kind of registering the fact that since the beginning of modernity in the 16th century, the attempt was made to impose this binary, you know. But in his wonderful essay, was kind of challenging the binary structure of the West and the rest. So we follow his lead, as well as the lead of many other scholars, when we propose a reversal of the phrase, the rest and the West. Of course, the rest and the West is a phrase, is a title, in the case of the book, that refers to the weakening of the West. But it does not refer to a kind of symmetrical reversal, meaning that the rest, the global south, will come to occupy the same position that once was of the West.
All right.
You know, what we try to do is precisely, you know, to work through all these notions in order to deconstruct them and to challenge the binary. You know.
Sure.
To challenge the binary because, you know, the binary can also nurture war. You know, while I think we have an urgent need to challenge the logic of war. And the logic of war is a binary logic.
Interesting. Thank you. I move to another, I mean, perhaps like to more personal concern mixed with the book and enlightened by the book. One of them is here, geopolitics, the concept of geopolitics. I quote you again, we wish to, I just want your elaboration actually. I quote you, you say we wish to focus on the implication of war for logistics and infrastructure. This nexus is by no means new, but we are convinced of its heightened importance today, both due to the relevance of these domains to contemporary capitalism and because it illuminates another key concatenation, namely the link between the COVID pandemic and war. In a part of the book, in the part of the book, you talk about the crisis of globalization's infrastructural skeleton and link it to the intertwining of geopolitics and geoeconomics. As you explain in chapter 3, again I'm quoting you, contemporary capitalism deploys forms of power that cannot be deemed simply economic, since they concur in important ways to the political task of governing territories and population. This may not be entirely new, as you said, but the intensity of such political effects of capital operation is indeed unprecedented, end of quote. This is the reason why you make use of the notion of political capitalism beyond established uses with respect to authoritarian states or to the use of national security. That is the whole quote from the book. What was interesting for me, and I'm curious to know, is the relation intertwining between geopolitics and geoeconomics in that regard.
Yes, you started with infrastructures, and then you asked this very interesting question. Just think of the kind of show that Benjamin Netanyahu gave at the General Assembly of the UN at the end of September. You remember that he was showing two maps. The first map was called the Kurds, and it was the axis of evil, from Hezbollah to Iran, from Syria to Hamas in Gaza. The second map was called the Blessing. This map showed a Middle East completely reorganized around a logistical and infrastructural project, which means the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that was launched last September in 2023 at the G20 in Delhi. It's basically a US project to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think that Netanyahu's show gives an idea of the intertwining of geopolitics and geoeconomics around logistics and infrastructures. And, for Brett and me, what you were mentioning in your question, which means the link between the COVID-19 pandemic and the current conjuncture of war, has also to do with logistics and infrastructures. Needless to say, there was no necessity. This is what the notion of conjuncture allows to do, to grasp connections that are not structurally necessary. A classical Marxist structural analysis cannot grasp a link between the COVID-19 pandemic and war. And the same is true for the connection between the Ukraine war and the war in the Middle East. They are completely different, but there was a kind of concatenation, as we say, precisely in this conjunction. But back to conclude to the connection between the COVID-19 pandemic and the conjuncture of war. What was stressed the most beyond the lives of hundreds of millions of people in the world during the pandemic? Supply chains. You will remember the photos of ports in the US, in China, in Korea, with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of containers that could not move. So also in the COVID-19 pandemic, this question of logistics and infrastructures was absolutely crucial.
Interesting. And it is here that you, I think, sort of talk, you and Michael Hart, both of you actually. I also interviewed him a couple of years ago. But even recently, you had both this idea of the conceptual language of crisis that should be actually rethought, should be reconsidered. I have here something in these instances that you talk. The impression is that the crisis is understood not as a challenge to be overcome, but rather as a state to be prolonged and reproduced in order to implement specific policies and measures. It's again something that you, in your recent article with Michael Hart about war, you somehow compare to the understanding of Foucault or Foucauldian question about prison, that why they need prison. Why? I mean, there is something reproduced there, yeah? So more generally, we are aware of the strategic relevance of the concept of crisis in the political lexicon of Western modernity. This is an interesting point, again, as I said, which reminds me both of Foucault's understanding of prison as well as Agamben's state of emergency somehow. But here, I go to another question. I try to really reduce some questions because I know you're running out of time. I have really 3 long questions that are very important for me. When it comes to resistance, I mean, talking about crisis, you and Michael Hart, both of you believe that we need to, as Deleuze would say, we need to arm ourselves with new concepts, for this new war. But when it comes to, my question is now not about crisis or crisis and capitalism, rather about resistance. Having talked about the new ways of depicting and conceptualizing crisis, I have a question about new forms of resistance. You say, I'm quoting you, in this sense, in an emergent multipolar world, there is a need to think again the question of translation and communication between movements confronting heterogeneous contexts and challenges and speaking different languages to articulate the refusal of domination and exploitation. It's from the book with Brett, end of quote, the new book. I think we need to rethink also the concept of resistance in that regard. Do you think we need new ways of looking at solidarity, for example, and problematizing? I have the impression that solidarity and resistance are not much the subject of analysis and research as an analysis of crisis. As a result, it is my impression, again, you can correct me definitely, it is extremely hard to make a distinction, it's a concrete example, between left solidarity and empire's benefits, sometimes for me. Let's take the example of supporting a movement. I use the example, the local example of Iran, because I was both present in Iran and outside during the uprisings, like what happened in women life freedom movement. I witnessed the uprisings 2 years ago, and I deeply appreciate the women in Iran are making an unprecedented movement against the solid values or pillars of life freedom. But I am talking about the fact that the solidarity with the movement outside Iran, especially through Iranian diaspora, completely neglected the geopolitical factors at work about Iran. And it is something that I noticed as a German citizen with German media, English and German television. To the extent that the Iranian diaspora were asking Western countries, which for me includes also Israel, the closest Western country to Iran, to punish Iran harder. I mean, be it through sanctions or through war. It was the very prevailing discourse like last 2 years. If the war is threatening a country like Iran for decades, which is today only more visible, as you said, it is interesting for me to ask this question, that I think resistance is somehow underexploited. I mean, when underexploited, it's not really, I mean, the research about resistance, if I want to be in solidarity with that kind of resistance, I am probably approving of power in the terms of empire, as you call it. I mean, I see there is a level of intellectual, I call it intellectual extraction, using your own terminology. There is a kind of intellectual extraction or even artistic extraction, I mean, which hijacks an uprising in a country and makes it homogenize in the West very easily. I mean, just look at the cinema that is appreciated in Berlin Festival, for example. It's one concrete example, yeah? If you have a film from Palestine, definitely no chance. But even to my sadness and with all my solidarity with Kurdish people, if a film is from Kurdish country, definitely it will be shown, because it will somehow question Iran. It will somehow question, so it is not that much discovered, let's say, the question of resistance. So I know that it's a topic that you raise in both your writings, in the book and also in the article. That's why I wanted to see what your...
It's a big question,
sure,
that contains many questions. We will try to unpack it, starting with the very notion of resistance. It's a notion that I do not like particularly. Of course, I use the word, but what concerns me in the emphasis on resistance is the fact that resistance has a reactive nature. It reacts to the operations of power or capital, and I am engaged for many years now, both as a scholar and as an activist, in an attempt to imagine constitutive forms of struggles, struggles that are not simply resistance, struggles that go beyond resistance, opening up new horizons.
But also use the word resistance in Deleuzian sense of active, not reactive necessarily.
Resistance comes first.
Right.
I mean, it's not very easy for me to understand. Since I was a kid, I grappled with this. But of course, yes, this is part of the story, But this is just to say why I don't emphasize resistance. The example you gave on speaking of Iran is very clear. As I was saying before, I have kind of strict relations with Iranians living in Europe, but also living in Iran. And I have very often the occasion to talk to them. I did it last week. And I am aware of what you are saying. This is something I was saying to these Iranian comrades when they were describing a situation in Iran, in the Iranian left, that is kind of caught in the double pincer of campism on the one hand, and the West as a liberator on the other hand. So we're talking precisely of the possibility to go beyond this alternative, in Iran, but also in the relations between, let's say, Iranian movements, forces of the left, and movements, forces of the left outside of Iran. This is the problem of internationalism that we raise in the last chapter of The Rest and the West. And we try to, to tackle this problem through a reflection on the practice of translation. Of course, this is kind of abstract and theoretical, but it has also very concrete implications. I can say it starting from my own experience. I mean, I remember going to Central America in the 1980s, early 1990s, and thinking that I understood everything, that it was very easy to communicate, with Sandinistas comrades or with people of the Farabundo Martí in Salvador, the two countries that I visited politically at that time. I took for granted that communication was easy, that we were talking the same language and facing similar experiences. And of course, this is not the case. Of course, this is not the case. So the emphasis on translation is simply the emphasis on the need of, let's say, a supplementary effort to really understand each other, and to look at the need to forge a common language. But a common language that is able to grasp the proliferation of differences, the moment of heterogeneity that I was stressing before.
Yeah, that's very inspiring what you say. But what I noticed, and I wanted to have it in my question, was that a lot of geopolitical and geoeconomical aspects of a movement in a country like Iran is usually ignored, because people think that the translation is already there.
It's already there, yes.
It is smooth and it is absolutely reflectable. But what is reflected among the intellectual left last 2 years about Iran is actually not much different from the media, from the mainstream media. That is my challenge now.
No, I understand. I get your point.
And it brings a country to the verge of war. Because, I mean, if I talk to my friends in Berlin, actually I don't see that they are opposing against the war, because they are afraid if they oppose the war, they are siding with Iran. So in the article, you see, my point is exactly what you said. I mean, we are talking the same thing. I mean, I want to say that the translation is not as smooth as it is expected, and it is a part of the
that's the point. This is the reason why I made a distinction between communication and translation.
Exactly.
To put it very easily, in the moment in which I started to think, maybe I don't really understand everything, I started to understand something. And this is politically very important. It also enables some kind of theoretical reflection and research.
That's definitely one thing that talking about war. I mean, So let me use the time and go to another question, because I don't know. There are a lot of things to learn and to exchange. I just want to. You say in the chapter called Regimes of War, that I'm quoting you, moralizing rhetoric and invocations of just war abound today on both sides, with a clear continuity in the West, with discourses that justify the wars of 1990s and 20s, and then you continue, those past discourses assume the existence of a sole superpower that exercise police function over a range of so-called rogue states, decentralized networks, and even hostile ethnic nationalism. This is not an accurate picture of the situation today. End of quote. It's very interesting, but I want to add, we see today in the Middle East hardly, what we say today in the Middle East today, hardly, with all the tragedies we have seen all these years, it really hardly convinces me that there is anything else more than determining the existence of one big power trying to expand its power. The disjunction of capitalism and territorialism, as you try to emphasize in the book, is an important factor, and I agree with that it's really true in a lot of cases. But to account for any analysis of the tensions and conflicts surrounding the constitution of a multipolar world, sometimes there is something missing. Giving appropriate analytical attention to these conditions means admitting the possibility of the existence of multiple forms of imperialism, each with different... sorry, that's a quote from you. It's a quote from you. I'm quoting you. Giving the appropriate analytical... I think that I'm back. I have to remake everything. Sorry. So let me make it clear. The question, I jump to the question, the very, very tiny question. Sometimes by appreciating deterritorialization in the rest, let's talk about Middle East now, like very nominally, by simply appreciating deterritorialization in the rest, the result for me is inevitably expansion of the West territories. You know what I mean? So I think when a movement, again coming to the movement question, I think we cannot ignore the geopolitical facets around a movement. You know, again, a personal experience was that once the movement happened, I was in Iran. Like 2 weeks, I was in Tehran and Shiraz, my hometown. And I came here and I said that all these Israeli and Saudi-led media are depicting the movement as an emancipatory movement in Iran. And I was wondering, I mean, all these channels, I was wondering that how the deterritorialization that is happening among women in Iran can be really reterritorialized here using the losing term. So I think, you see my point? I mean, the risk is that attributing only deterritorialization to the progressive movements in another part of the world might actually only help to expand the territorialization here.
Again, main questions, you know.
So it's actually, sorry.
No, it's good. I mean, it's the same attitude that
and
I
challenges
have.
that we have both, right? Yeah.
But let me start by saying something important. In the East and the West, the war is an important stake. But you don't find the word Gaza. Why? Of course, because it was delivered, the manuscript was delivered several months before October 7, 2023. And we explain it in the preface, you know. So the first quote...
But in the article with Michael Hart, you have
Yeah,
that,
okay,
right?
that's something else. But the first quote that you read refers to the Ukraine war. As I was saying, we are convinced that it is important to pay attention at this moment of concatenation between the Ukraine war and the war in the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah, we have to say that. But they remain a different kind of wars. You know, I don't disregard geopolitical dynamics and logics. I try to take them into account, but without thinking that they explain everything.
Right.
Which means also trying to shed light on the limits of geopolitical dynamics and logics. So, regarding the Middle East, also for want of time, let me put it very quickly. Let me arc back to the map that Netanyahu showed at the General Assembly of the UN. In that map, the economic corridor between India and Europe, through the Gulf, through Israel, through Greece, plays a very important role. I mean, it's kind of conditional possibility of the Middle East that he was imagining, you know. At the time in which we are talking, it doesn't seem very realistic. It would presuppose, you know, a completely different attitude by Saudi Arabia, for instance, that cannot be taken for granted, you know. So you see that there are let's say, geoeconomic logics that intermingle with geopolitical logics and set limits to such logics. Then, if you ask me about the strategic goals of Israel nowadays in the Middle East, I mean, it is very difficult for me to reply. Okay, if we were in an assembly, I could give a rhetorical answer, but we are talking, I mean, to make a scenario. What seems to me is that Israel has kind of regained its military might, the power of intelligence, the pages, all this stuff. And so, from a tactical point of view, has a clear advantage. But strategically, I mean, it's very difficult to see where it is going. And this is something you can read in the main US newspapers, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. I mean, it's not such an illogical statement. And then, to conclude, you are right with respect to movements and geopolitics. The attempt Brett and I do in the rest and the West is precisely to stress the importance of this link and to look at social movements writ large, as we say, also considering them actual or potential geopolitical forces. This means to look at the way in which the development of social movements has an impact on geopolitical dynamics. It's a beginning for us, it's a principle of method, and I hope also other people welcome this.
Definitely, it's a fascinating and intricate book, and with a lot of facets and to learn. I have one question, and I finish.
Yes,
and I leave you. Yes, I'm sorry to take your time on Friday afternoon. So that's a bit of a long question. I try to really shorten that. You say, I'm quoting you, the rest and the West takes this expanded notion of extraction as a background for an analysis that foregrounds the tensions, challenges, and processes of adaptation. I go further on page 128, I'm quoting you, you say, with the term regimes of war, we describe a militarization of political and economic life that exceeds the actual engagement of military forces on the ground and may even exist independently from such mobilizations. Although it is important to recognize that the involvement of military forces in activities other than war often complements such militarization beyond war, these processes are also accompanied by a general tendency for civilian and economic life to reshape military affairs. End of quote. It's very interesting to see that war is not seen here simply as something separate or something transcendent or something even metaphorical. Yesterday, I actually last night after I read an article interestingly by Adam Tooze that you also mention in the book, claiming that the idea that Biden is just muddling through this global crisis is not convincing. He says that, that's interesting, he says that when you look closely in foreign policy, Biden has been more radical than Trump. Talking about of course, Abraham Accord started with Trump, but talking about this from India to Greece, all these G20 meetings. He says, I'm quoting Adam Tooze, there is one school of thought that says that Biden administration is modeling true. It has no grand plan. It lacks the will or the means to discipline or direct either the Ukrainians or the Israelis. As a result, it is mainly focused on avoiding a third world war, Biden, end of quote. Interestingly, Adam Tooze, later in the article, it's a short but interesting article, he asks, what if what we are witnessing is the pivoting of the US to a deliberate and comprehensive revisionism by way of strategy of tension? In the end of this short article, he says that the US is paying for more than 25% of Israel's rampage as it physically annihilates Gaza and victimizes the West Bank and sets about uprooting Hezbollah. It has pulled allies such as Germany and UK into the line. Of course, unlike Ukraine, the US has continued diplomacy, but to what effect? First and foremost, to keep Iran boxed in and the powerful Gulf states on side. Meanwhile, Israel is wiping out Iran's network of influence and annihilating the 1990s vision of two-state solution. In all three arenas, China, Ukraine, and Middle East, the US will say that it is responding to aggression. But rather than working consistently for a return to the status quo. So I just cut this long quote and come to the question. Sandro, I have the impression, quoting one line from the article, you say that we seem to have, you and Michael Hart, you see that we seem to have entered a period of war without end, the beginning of the article, extending across the globe and unsettling even the central nodes of the world system, end of the quote. I think that it has been made possible, this fact that we seem to have entered a period of war without end, I think that has been made possible through new forms of violence. Do you agree? Only new forms of violence, I'm not talking about metaphorical violence or only linguistic violence. The fact that we are living in an age of unending war has been made possible through new forms of violence. That is the last epiphany that I had to finish this interview. What do you think about it? So it is not transcendent. It doesn't come from heaven. It is something that we have. It has not been labeled as violence, but suddenly we see that, oh no.
But what do you mean by new forms of violence? One example.
One example is sanction.
Okay, yes. Sanctions have a long history.
Yeah, so it's not seen as war, but it is,
new. But it is war, of course. Yeah. That's a good example, just to understand what you had in mind, Of course, there are also other forms of violence that could be mentioned.
Sure.
Just think of the role of drug cartels and the army in the quote and unquote management of migration in Mexico.
Sure.
Just to make an example.
Yeah.
Or the Amazon, the huge amount of indigenous leaders, ecological activists that have been killed. These are not to be forgotten. But your example points toward, the growing distinction between war and peace, to put it quickly, And indeed, if you think of the whole discussion surrounding hybrid war, we are again confronted with new forms of violence, finance as a kind of weapon, and then the whole question, of the digital world, forms of hacking can be very, very violent. I think this is a long-term process. Again, it didn't start with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There was a very nice, striking book written by two, at the time they were not generals, they were officers of the People's Liberation Army of China. In the mid-1990s, War Without Limits. I mean, that's a book that deserves to be read again today, because many tendencies were foreshadowed in this book. Of course, it is difficult to say if such transformations of war, such new forms of violence are at the root of the current conjuncture of war. I think we have to look at multiple dimensions in order to understand its genealogy and its possible development, and we need to understand its possible developments to struggle against the war, to struggle against the war regime everywhere in the world. Let me conclude in a kind of rhetorical way. I think it is needed.
Definitely. Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, Sandro. Fantastic book and fantastic talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.